Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Pastor B. Chavez Russell here at Greater Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, and we are completing year 2. So I'm still a baby pastor. So, but I tell you what, since I've been in the Twin Cities, our speaker today has been someone that has really inspired me, someone that's really been a beacon of wisdom and knowledge, not only in our church but in our community. So we thank you all for being here today. Thank you for hosting this event here. And everybody that's online, we have it live online. Thank you for joining us, whether now or later. We certainly appreciate you. And without further ado, I want to introduce to you our speaker for the day, none other than Judge LaJune Lange.
Thank you very much, Reverend Russell. It was appropriate that we gather today at Greater Friendship, one of the historic Black Baptist churches. The church had a watch night service, and I think all of you who are historians know how important watch night was the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation on the eve of January 1st of 1963. People gathered in homes and churches waiting for the clock to tick off and for the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Abraham Lincoln to come into effect. The church has been, for the Black church, the AME church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the various African Baptist churches and Free Will Baptist churches, have been at the forefront of both historic preservation, civic engagement, and the rendering of services to enslaved and formerly enslaved people. Because as you know, we did not have any form of community service or any kind of assistance to people who had been denied the ability to save money or own property and suddenly found themselves free. So I'm getting a little ahead of the story. We want to start with a video that we researched and compiled, which is called Longfellow, Our Journey, which we're just going to show you a short portion to set the tone.
Our journey, or at least part of it, begins on the tranquil shores of the Mississippi. This is Fort Snelling State Park, what used to be Dakota land, and what they believe was a place of creation. This same land would be the origin of many African American roots in Minnesota. In 1863, the Davenport and Northerner brought more than 500 newly freed enslaved men, women, and children from the South. The boats docked right here. Their ropes were tied around these very trees, leaving century-old scars in the wood. In the oral tradition of the Dakota people, it is said that the boat that brought Dred Scott to Minnesota.
Well, the Longfellow neighborhood has a unique intersection of history. We have the Fort Snelling, which was the largest place of enslavement in the Midwest. And we also have Dred Scott, who lived with his wife Harriet at Fort Snelling and ultimately went to St. Louis and sued for his freedom. And the various efforts that Dred Scott made to gain his freedom resulted in a U.S. Supreme Court decision, which the Supreme Court said a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And so that was a prelude to our Civil War in the United States, among many other factors that were going on at the time. We had the Fugitive Slave Law. We had the abolition of slavery in Canada in 1834. We had the abolition of slavery in Great Britain in 1834. And so we were surrounded by forces of change. At the end of the Mexican-American War, which also had a tone of slavery, there were states that were going to be admitted to the United States, and the debate was whether they were going to enter as free states or enter as an opportunity to expand slavery. So slavery has been part of our national discussion since the founding of our country. The conflicts over slavery impacted our nation, and right here in Minnesota, we have some direct on-the-ground connections. So we look at Dred Scott, and we look at the area where Fort Snelling was, and we see that importance, and we also see that after Dred and Harriet Scott left, and we were looking closer to actually getting involved in the Civil War, our Minnesota government volunteered the first troops to serve. And so as a result of that, we had recognition shortly after statehood in terms of our dedication to the Union. But that wasn't the whole story. There were many people left in Minnesota trying to figure out what their status was going to be at the end of this war. There were families that were torn apart by the repeated drafts that occurred, because the original estimation of the war was that it would only be a few months, and miscalculations and other things by generals extended that war into a prolonged conflict taking years. We had, in May of 1863, after the Second Confiscation Act, we had steamboats chartered by the military to go down to St. Louis, Missouri, and bring up what we called contraband at the time, formerly enslaved people who wished to come north for a better opportunity. And the Second Confiscation Act allowed those people to not only be forever free, but also allowed them to be employed by the U.S. government. So they could be teamsters, they could be undercooks, they could join when the U.S. colored troops were formed, they could join the military. And there was also a provision in the Second Confiscation Act that allowed a person who had the means to pay $300, they could pay for someone to take their place in the draft. So we have a record in Minnesota at Fort Snelling of meeting our military quotas through both volunteers and through the use of substitutes. And so many times these substitutes connect with our research to the families that came up in May of 1863 from Missouri, from the contraband camps, and who were housed on the grounds of Fort Snelling. And so in May of 1863, you had, we'd call it Camp Misery. You had contraband camps on the grounds of Fort Snelling, and you had a concentration camp on the grounds of Fort Snelling where Native American people were confined. And so when the steamboats coming in May of 1863 brought the people who they thought, according to the recruiters, were going to be males, they brought full families plus males, because the people had been through enough and they weren't going to be just worked and separated from their families. So they came on these steamboats with their children and with their wives. And the military only had use for the males. So the wives and children in a segregated military base had no accommodations. So they were able to seek housing in what is called Richfield, because the area around the fort became Richfield and extended into this neighborhood we call Longfellow. So that whole southern quadrant of the city was impacted by new arrivals, and many of them lived either in the Richfield area or came a little further down to Snelling Avenue, which back then was still Richfield, because it wasn't until the very late 1800s that Minneapolis annexed Richfield past Lake Street. So we have a history in Minneapolis when we talk about our city that we don't include Richfield, so there's a whole big missing part of how we tell our narrative, because we don't talk about how we annexed this population and who lived where and what their contributions were. So our research with the International Leadership Institute has been to start with the historical narrative that has been well researched, and then try to fill in the gaps to tell the full story. And we have done that effectively by locating descendants of some of these very, very early African American families who arrived in either on the boats in 1863 or came before that, like the Emily Gray and her husband, who came in the 1850s. And so we've connected with their descendants and learned more of the story with regard to what was happening in Minnesota. So Ralph Gray was one of those people who came, an African descendant person. He came in the 1850s and started a barbershop at the Jarrett House when Minnesota was a territory. His wife Emily joined him in 1857. They became part of the territorial pioneers and were very active in terms of abolitionist efforts, and I think all of you have heard about their effort to free Eliza Winston, a woman who was enslaved by a visiting Southern planter. But they had more activities than just Eliza Winston. Emily Gray's maiden name was Goodrich, and her father was a leader in the Underground Railroad in York, Pennsylvania. And he later came and lived with them in Minneapolis. Her father was a friend of Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass later came to Minnesota and was hosted by them and included in as many events as he could do at a time with limited transportation. But he was able to give an address in downtown Minneapolis at one of the newest lecture halls and fill it completely when invited by the Grays. When we had the Civil War going, and we had men volunteering to serve in the colored troops, men risking their life to be a substitute for another Minnesotan who they had no connection to, the men and the families of African descent felt that they were moving closer to full citizenship. Yet they did not have that in Minnesota. So what was necessary, since there was not citizenship rights to African descendant people, is that they had to file a petition statewide, presented to the legislature for a constitutional amendment to allow black men to be able to have the right to vote. And so that petition drive, presentation to the legislature, and a vote statewide took place 3 times in Minnesota before it was passed. And so that vote was finally passed by a majority of the white men in Minnesota, because we know the women didn't have the right to vote in the 1860s. So the men voted, and a majority gave black men the right to vote. So black men celebrated. It was also the anniversary in 1868 of January 1 again of the Emancipation Proclamation. So they had what was called a Colored People's Convention in St. Paul to take stock of this important event of taking and gaining the right to vote, and what that meant in terms of the responsibilities that also attached for civic improvement, education, and participation in civic life. So that Colored People's Convention was a moment where Ralph Gray, again, who came from territorial days, read the Emancipation Proclamation in 1868 at this event in St. Paul. But we have not, to the history's satisfaction, recognized the importance of our role in Minnesota. Minnesota was not only the first to volunteer soldiers, but we also had the last living Civil War soldier in Minnesota to die. And we have been working through the Institute to reach out to families who served in that important Civil War as part of the U.S. Colored Troops, to make sure that their burial places are honored, that their graves are recognized, and that there are markers on their graves. So we will go to the next slide, and I will talk about the connection between Fort Snelling and that geographic area, Dred Scott, and a man who's on the minds of every one in this state, and that's George Floyd. So George Floyd also was in that same quadrant, just a few miles from where Dred Scott was at Fort Snelling. And of course, if you want the technical image of Fort Snelling in 1839, Fort Snelling was far, far larger than we regard it today. So if you look at the footprints of Dred Scott and the footprints of George Floyd, they logically could have intersected in that 38th and Chicago area, because Fort Snelling was so large. And George Floyd died on that ground that is historic, that enslaved people, that pioneer people, that Native American people had walked. And it's important that we, as we look at what to do with 38th Street in Chicago, that we recognize the importance to the nation and the world of the consciousness and the important thoughtfulness that we should take as Minnesotans to recognize what happened and how, like Dred Scott's efforts, been to the fort. So the Minnesota Historical Society and the Fort Snelling staff graciously welcomed her and brought her into the Dred Scott residence. It was, you could hear a pin drop. It was just a moment that you can't describe. I was fortunate enough to be there when it happened, and to see this connection of history, for her to be able to see the ground where her ancestors walked, and to take in that brick room was incredible. And so when we tell the full story, we impact more people, we make the experience richer, and we are more true to ourselves in terms of not skipping over important parts of our history. And so we'll go to the next slide. I think we have Corporal John Wesley Harper. And we have some descendants of Corporal Harper in the room today. And we have Corporal Harper became Sergeant Harper with his service later. So I'll start at the beginning of the story. And Corporal Harper was living in Ohio when the call came that a U.S. Colored Troop regiment was going to be formed after the law permitted people of color to bear arms. And so this newly formed fighting unit was called the Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Regiment. And from Zanesville, Ohio, John Wesley Harper was recruited to become part of that. One of the chief recruiters for the Massachusetts 54th was a man by the name of Frederick Douglass, and I think all of you know him. And Frederick Douglass also recruited his sons to serve in the Massachusetts 54th. So the Massachusetts 54th saw brutal, horrific fighting. They lost over 50% of their men through combat, but John Wesley Harper was one of those who was able to survive. So their leader, Colonel Shaw, died in battle, and after many years of debate and struggle, the people of Massachusetts had the opportunity to erect a statue in the honor of Colonel Shaw. But they also knew that Colonel Shaw would not be Colonel Shaw without the courageous black men under his leadership. So the sculptor was directed to put in the black soldiers next to Colonel Shaw. And the honor to the men of the Massachusetts 54th was that the surviving men of the 54th, at the dedication of the statue, were invited to march in uniform down the streets of Boston when the statue was installed. So Corporal Harper was able to come and march in uniform during that ceremony when the statue was installed. He maintained his Civil War uniform. He had moved to Minnesota in the early 1800s as part of the 25th U.S. Infantry and was stationed at Fort Snelling. And since Fort Snelling was a segregated military base and it was segregated from the day it opened to the day it closed, they built temporary wooden barracks for the colored soldiers, and the colored soldiers stayed in those temporary wooden barracks at Fort Snelling. So Mr. Harper was able to raise a family of 16 children in Minnesota. And so when you have 16 children, you have a number of cousins and second cousins and third cousins. So some of the family members are here. Tanae and her mom are descendants of Colonel Harper. And we also recognize him as Sergeant Harper. But our efforts with Harry Davis, who was carrying the memory of Corporal Harper or / Sergeant Harper at his death, wanted his descendant, his ancestor to be recognized, and he came to the International Leadership Institute asking that this undertold story be given full recognition. We went to Fox 9 News, asked them to talk about our research and assist us in getting a marker for his grave. He was buried at the Crystal Lake Cemetery without the U.S. Colored Troops marker. And so through the efforts of the family and the publicity, the U.S. Department of Defense has agreed to provide the U.S. Colored Troops replica marker, and this spring, given a date decided by the family, they will install the marker at his family plot at Crystal Lake. And there's many more families who have loved ones who were not given markers for their graves, so we're going bit by bit to work with those families to make sure that they get the honor and recognition that they desire and are entitled to. We have an ongoing effort to involve descendants in our research because it is their story. It's not just us who are writing and researching through files and records, it's the life and bloodline of real people. So we feel the inclusion of the descendant is very, very important. We have researched one of the families that hired a substitute to take their place during the Civil War. And this substitute, Mr. Dixon, actually died of disease during the Civil War. So this family had passed on the story that, great-grandpa lived because somebody else took his place in the Civil War. And we were able to interview the family that had that legacy of a substitute. But there are many, many more substitute stories that we are researching, so we hope to continue this discussion and be able to talk to you about that. We had efforts across the country, which the Confiscation Act and other laws permitted the substitutes, so it wasn't anything under the table. The person was paid $300 by the person who was seeking the substitute upon enlistment and participation in the military. So it was not totally an uncommon thing, it's just an undertold story. So we're trying to bring that portion out so that people know the stories of those who volunteered, those who helped other families keep the farm by going in their place, and those who also work to help make citizens and access to citizenship in Minnesota. So the effort by the U.S. the Colored People's Convention was a statewide effort. So you can imagine in the 1860s doing a statewide petition drive, you had to go by horse, wagon, foot to cover the entire state. But there was no stone left unturned. People were organized, and as I said, by the third effort, they were very, very organized. So once they got the governor's ear and got the citizenship, they didn't let go. Black people stayed involved with politics continuously. There was not a time where they did not feel that those political connections no longer needed to be nurtured. So in the Longfellow neighborhood, we have something that's called the Hiawatha Golf Course. And I think many of you are aware of the various controversies and also aware that there have been African American families, both men and women, who fought for the right to use a public golf course back in the 30s. And once they got the right to use the public golf course, they golfed for that 4 or 5 hours, depending on how good or bad you were, without being able to use the toilet because the clubhouse facility was segregated. So they let the black players come to the golf course, but said, you can't eat in the clubhouse and you can't use the toilet. So we have talked to a number of black golfers whose fathers and grandfathers were golfing under those restrictions, and about the coolers and the sandwiches and all the other makeshift things that they had to put together to be able to have a modicum of pleasure on the golf course and stay regular. We had Joe Louis play golf at the Hiawatha Golf Course. We had Tiger Woods come and select Hiawatha Golf Course so he could give a demonstration. And we had things called the Bronze Tournament and Upper Midwest Golfing Tournaments. So we've had a number of different events continuously in that Longfellow neighborhood at the Hiawatha Golf Course. And so one of those families was, again, the Sergeant Harper's family. One of his descendants, Harry Davis Sr., was a regular golfer at the golf course, as was another mentee named Richard Green. And Harry Davis was a long-term member of the school board, and Richard Green became the superintendent of schools. And then they selected a neighborhood to try to integrate the schools. So Field and Hale were the two schools selected for that integration. And again, back to that historic Longfellow area for that first integration in the 1970s. So we've had a number of different events that touch the nation that emanate out of that quadrant of the city, but we need to lift it up more. We need to fill in the blanks, and we need to involve the descendants more so that they can have ownership and tell the stories of their families and where they fit in. We have also, with the pioneer families like Ralph and Emily Gray, there are many areas of their lives and contributions that we are seeking to bring to a higher level to the public, and we hope if we have another opportunity to address you in the future, we'll be able to tell you our progress with Ralph and Emily Gray and their descendants. So I want to leave time for questions, and so I'll stop here and see if there are any questions.
At the time, were most of the substitutes black? And how much was $300 at that time?
Check.
Well, the military pay was $13 a month. So $300 was a lot of money at that time. And the substitutes that we're researching are the black substitutes, and the records of the Historical Society reflect 13, but we believe there are more.
Thank you. Could I beleaguer one more question? And that is, are you familiar with the Lee House on Columbus Avenue?
Yes.
Could you tell me the status of that?
Well, as far as we know, the Lee House on Columbus Avenue is still on the National Register of Historic Places. In our later in the film, which we didn't show in full length, but you can look at online, we interviewed one of Lee's descendants who became a firefighter in the first batch of firemen to integrate after the second effort to integrate the Minneapolis Fire Department. And so Arthur Lee was his name over on Columbus Avenue, who bought the house in the 1930s in a restricted neighborhood from a man who had financial difficulty. And Arthur Lee had the honor of serving in World War II and had the money and the means to buy the house. And then there were literally thousands of people from the neighborhood who came to protest this black man in the approximately 1931 buying, because they had squeezed out the black people and had restrictive covenants and did not expect any of the homeowners to sell to a black person. So the U.S. Postal Union, along with others, formed a human chain around Lee's house because Lee was a postal carrier. And so they formed a line of protection to protect Lee's home from these thousands of people. And a woman by the name of Lena Smith, who was an attorney, one of the first black woman to graduate from William Mitchell College of Law, was the attorney who came to represent Mr. Lee and to be his Olivia Pope in times of crisis, to talk to the media and say, we are not moving. We're not going to be run out by a mob. And Lena Smith was also very active in, later on over the years, defending people in civil rights cases and also real estate cases. And she lived on 37th and 5th Avenue. So that whole South Side neighborhood was an incubator for people who were very committed, very active, and also sought the skills and training to be able to fill those roles that the black community needed.
Thank you.